They grounded me for a petty seating dispute, but they had no idea I just locked their entire fleet to the tarmac to prevent a catastrophe. Now, a high-stakes conspiracy is unfolding, and I'm the only one standing between their illegal operation and a total mid-air disaster. I've spent 15 years climbing the ladder in the aviation industry. I've logged over 12,000 flight hours, navigated through brutal Atlantic storms, and handled engine failures that would make a rookie faint. I did it all while constantly being the only person of color in the cockpit. You learn to develop a thick skin, to swallow your pride, and to let your performance speak for itself. But yesterday, my professional integrity finally collided with a level of institutional arrogance I couldn't ignore. We were parked at the gate in Atlanta, boarding for a standard cross-country flight. The cabin was buzzing, the usual chaotic energy of a full flight. I was at the gate desk reviewing the final manifest with the lead flight attendant when I heard a commotion in the jet bridge. A man in an expensive charcoal suit was shouting at one of our gate agents, a young woman who looked like she was about to cry. "I'm a Platinum Elite status member," the man boomed, his voice echoing through the terminal. "I don't sit in the back. I don't sit behind people who think they're entitled to my seat. Get that man out of 1A or I'm calling your regional director." I stepped in, maintaining my composure. "Sir, I'm the captain of this flight. Is there a problem?" The man turned, looked me up and down with a sneer that didn't even acknowledge my uniform, and laughed. "Oh good, you're the captain? Then tell your staff to do their jobs. I booked 1A 3 months ago. Some guy who clearly doesn't belong in the front is sitting there, and I want him moved." I looked toward the seat. It was a gentleman, older, dressed in worn-out work clothes, likely someone who had spent his life savings on a comfortable seat for his retirement. "Sir," I said firmly, "that passenger has a valid boarding pass for that seat. It's been assigned to him." "I don't care about the pass," he snapped. "I care about the caliber of people I'm forced to share a cabin with. I pay for an experience, not a social experiment. Move him or I'll make sure you're scrubbing hangar floors by the end of the week." I stood my ground, my hands clasped behind my back. "I'm not moving a paying passenger who has done nothing wrong. Please take your assigned seat or leave the aircraft." The passenger whipped out his phone, making a call. 5 minutes later, the station manager came rushing down the jet bridge, looking pale and frantic. He didn't even look at me. He went straight to the man in the suit, shook his hand, and whispered something. Then he turned to me. "Captain, we're going to have to ask you to step aside. We're putting an alternate pilot on this flight. You're grounded for the day." My jaw tightened. "Excuse me? I'm the captain assigned to this flight. My pre-flight checks are done. The aircraft is ready." "It's a corporate decision," the manager said, his eyes darting away from mine. "A misunderstanding of policy. You're being removed from duty pending a review." I felt the heat rising in my chest, but I kept my voice eerily calm. If they wanted to play games with my livelihood, they had clearly forgotten who actually controlled the safety of that aircraft. I turned and walked toward the cockpit, not to fly, but to finish my logs. As I passed the gate, the station manager called out, "Don't bother, Captain. We've already locked your digital credentials." I stepped into the cockpit one last time, knowing exactly how to handle a situation where an airline compromises safety protocols for the sake of a temperamental elite status traveler. I realized then that they had left the maintenance logs open and the aircraft's internal diagnostic report exposed on the console. It was a massive breach of procedure, a direct violation of safety protocols that could lead to a catastrophic failure if ignored. They were so focused on removing me that they hadn't realized I had already initiated a mandatory maintenance hold on the hydraulic system. Without my digital override, which was currently tied to my credentials that they had just deactivated, the plane couldn't move an inch. The engines were locked in a safety standby mode. The station manager and the elite passenger pushed past the flight attendants, heading toward the cockpit, ready to humiliate me further. The passenger was smirking, already recording a video on his phone. "You're finished," the passenger spat as they reached the door. "I'm going to make sure you never fly again." I stood up, stepped out of the cockpit, and looked the station manager directly in the eye. "You want to ground me? Fine. But you've also grounded your flight. The hydraulics are locked by protocol, and because you deactivated my clearance without following the proper transfer procedure, the system is now in an automated shutdown state. You aren't going anywhere today." The manager's face went white. "You can't do that. That's an obstruction." "No," I replied, grabbing my bag and walking toward the jet bridge. "That's safety. And if you force the system to override, you'll be in direct violation of federal aviation regulations. Good luck explaining to the board why you tried to force a flight with a compromised hydraulic pressure sensor. I'll be waiting in the terminal to see how you explain this one." I walked away, the silence in the jet bridge suddenly heavy. But as I reached the terminal entrance, I saw 2 security officers walking toward me with grave expressions. They weren't from the airline. They were from the service that handles high-level protocol investigations. My heart skipped a beat as the lead officer pulled out a badge. "Captain," he said, his tone icy, "we need you to come with us. We've received a report that you've allegedly engaged in an act of intentional sabotage to keep this plane from departing. This is no longer just about a seat change. You're facing a very serious accusation, and you need to answer for it right now." The 2 men in dark suits flanked me with the precision of a surgical strike. The bustling terminal around us seemed to fade into a blur of gray. The hurried passengers, the announcements of departures and arrivals, the mundane chaos of travel, it all became background noise. My focus was entirely on the man who had spoken. He wasn't airport security. His posture, his eyes, these were the hallmarks of someone accustomed to handling crises that didn't involve lost luggage or seating disputes. "I'm sorry, what exactly did you say?" I asked, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline spiking in my veins. "Sabotage? I initiated a safety protocol based on a sensor reading. That's not sabotage, that's the job description." The man closest to me stepped forward, his expression devoid of empathy. "The station manager has already filed an official report. He claims you intentionally locked the hydraulic system as an act of retaliation after you were relieved of duty. In the eyes of the aviation authority, that's not a safety check. That's a move designed to interfere with commercial operations. And given the status of the passenger you offended, this has reached the level of a serious, high-priority investigation. You're coming with us to the internal security hub." I felt the weight of the situation crashing down. The elite status passenger had leverage, and he was using it to turn a simple power trip into a career-ending nightmare. I looked toward the gate. Through the glass, I could see the station manager standing near the cockpit door, his phone pressed to his ear, gesturing wildly at the flight crew. He wasn't just trying to get the plane moving. He was orchestrating my public humiliation. "I have my flight logs and the sensor data stored on my tablet," I said, my voice rising just enough to sound authoritative. "If you check the internal diagnostics, you'll see the pressure drop was real. If this plane had taken off, it would have been a disaster." "We'll see what the data says once we have it in our custody," the second officer replied, motioning toward the terminal exit. "For now, surrender your identification and your personal electronics. Do not try to contact anyone. You are being held for questioning regarding an attempt to disrupt airline infrastructure." As they led me away from the gates and down a sterile, windowless hallway, I realized that this wasn't just a simple disciplinary hearing. This was an attempt to make an example out of me. They weren't just firing me. They were going to ensure I never held a pilot's license again. My entire life's work, the years of study, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, was being dismantled by a man who couldn't stand the sight of a black man in a command position. We reached a private elevator. The officer swiped a badge and the doors slid open to reveal a quiet, high-security area of the airport that most passengers never even knew existed. They led me into a small room with nothing but a metal table and 2 chairs. They took my phone and my tablet, placing them into an evidence bag. "Stay here," the lead officer commanded. "Someone will be in to take your statement shortly. Don't touch anything." The door clicked shut, leaving me in a silence that felt like a prison cell. I sat there, my hands trembling slightly. I needed to think. If I just sat and waited, I was playing into their hands. I had to prove that the hydraulic issue was legitimate, but my access to the system was gone. Or was it? I remembered my personal laptop, which I had left in my flight bag in the crew lounge. It wasn't just a computer, it was linked to a private, encrypted cloud account that mirrored my aircraft's telemetry logs. If I could get to that, I could prove the sensor failure. But I was locked in a room in the most secure part of the airport. Suddenly, the door handle turned. I expected an interrogator. Instead, a woman walked in, someone I recognized from the airline's engineering department, someone who had always been a quiet advocate for safety standards over corporate profit. She looked nervous, glancing over her shoulder before shutting the door behind her. "I heard what happened," she whispered, leaning over the table. "They're scrubbing the manifest, and they're already uploading a corrected diagnostic report to the FAA servers. They're erasing the evidence of the hydraulic pressure loss. They aren't just trying to frame you for the delay, they're trying to cover up a structural flaw in the entire fleet to save their stock price." My blood ran cold. "They're going to fly that plane?" "They're prepping it to depart in 20 minutes, she replied, her voice trembling. "They've brought in a skeleton crew to force a manual override. If they fly that plane, the hydraulic failure will be catastrophic during climb-out. They're gambling with hundreds of lives just to spite you." She slid a small, thin drive across the table toward me. "This is the raw log from the server I managed to copy before they locked me out of the main terminal. It proves the system was failing, and it proves you tried to prevent the launch. But you're on camera in here. If you're found with this, they'll call it evidence of an even more dangerous, premeditated conspiracy." Before I could answer, the door swung open again. It was the lead officer, and he wasn't alone. He had the station manager with him, and his face was twisted in a triumphant grin. "Well, Captain," the manager said, stepping into the room and staring at the drive sitting on the table, "I think we've found the real reason you were so intent on grounding this flight. What is that? A way to access the airline's secure database?" The officer reached for his sidearm holster, his eyes narrowing. "You weren't just sabotaging a flight, were you? You were trying to steal corporate data. That changes everything. You're under arrest for espionage and intent to cause a mass casualty event." My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked at the manager, then at the officer, and realized the trap had been perfectly set. The door behind them began to close, and through the sliver of light, I saw the airport police force moving toward the room, weapons drawn. My life was about to be destroyed, but as I looked at the drive, I realized I had one last, desperate move. And if it failed, there would be no turning back. The metallic click of the door lock sounded like a gavel echoing in a courtroom. The station manager stood there, his face glowing with a malicious, predatory satisfaction. He reached out to grab the drive, but I was faster. My hand closed around the small piece of plastic, and I stood up, my pulse drumming in my ears like a jet engine at full throttle. "You really think you can frame this as espionage?" I barked, my voice projecting with a confidence I didn't entirely feel. "That drive doesn't contain stolen secrets. It contains the real-time telemetry from the aircraft's black box that your team is currently trying to wipe. If you think for 1 second that I'm going to let you jeopardize the lives of 300 passengers just to cover your tracks and satisfy some ego-driven suit, you've severely underestimated who you're dealing with." The officer's hand rested heavily on his holster. Drop the drive, Captain. You're already knee-deep in a grave you dug yourself. Interference, obstruction, and now possession of unauthorized corporate data. You're looking at an incredibly long stretch in federal prison, and trust me, there won't be a pilots' union in the world willing to touch this case. I didn't blink. I knew that if I surrendered the drive, the truth about the aircraft's failed hydraulic system would be incinerated within minutes. The plane would take off, and the odds of those passengers surviving the mid-air failure were effectively zero. I looked at the station manager. You're willing to kill them for this? To save your bonus? To protect your reputation because you were too arrogant to admit a plane was grounded for safety. The manager laughed, a dry, hollow sound. They're passengers, Captain. Statistics. They're replaceable. You, however, are a liability. A very loud, very inconvenient liability that needs to be permanently removed from the workforce. He signaled to the officers. They started closing in, their movements synchronized and cold. I looked around the room. There was no exit, no vent large enough to crawl through, just the harsh, artificial light and the looming threat of the heavy, reinforced door. I had one card left to play, but it required the one thing I wasn't supposed to have, an active connection to the airport's internal network. My phone was in the evidence bag on the table. If I could bridge the connection between the drive and the airport's public address override, a system I knew from years of internal security training, I could broadcast the telemetry data directly to the monitors in the terminal. I would lose the battle for my career, but I could win the war for those passengers' lives. You're making a mistake, I said, backing toward the table. Enough, the officer roared, lunging forward. I didn't run away. I lunged at the table, swiping the evidence bag off the surface and hitting the ground in a roll. As I hit the floor, I kicked the metal table into the officer's legs, throwing him off balance. In the chaos, I grabbed my phone, punched in the emergency bypass code for the digital display system, a code that was supposedly deactivated years ago, but, as I suspected, the IT department had been too lazy to actually rotate, and shoved the drive into the port. "What are you doing?" the station manager shrieked, realizing what was happening as the monitors on the wall of the interrogation room suddenly flickered to life. A wall of raw data began scrolling across the screens. Pressure logs, red-lined warnings, and the exact timestamp of the maintenance failure. It was broadcast to every terminal gate in the building, every passenger, every ground crew member, and every federal air marshal in the airport could see it. The plane was grounded by technical default. "You fool!" the manager screamed, lunging for the server panel. "You've just ruined us!" "I've just saved a flight," I shouted back, though my triumph was cut short by the sound of the door crashing open. It wasn't just the police anymore. A team of federal investigators rushed in, guns drawn. But they weren't looking at me. They were looking at the station manager and the glowing screens displaying the undeniable proof of corporate negligence. "Step away from the control panel," the lead federal agent commanded, his eyes scanning the data on the wall. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Captain, you're currently in possession of protected aviation logs. You are under detention, but not for the reason you think." He glanced at the manager, then back at me. "We've been tracking a pattern of safety violations at this hub for months. We were waiting for a whistleblower with enough guts to trigger an automated alert like this. But you didn't just expose a maintenance flaw. By bypassing the corporate firewall, you've tripped an internal blackout protocol that the airline uses to hide their most dangerous, illicit shipments." My stomach dropped. I hadn't just exposed a broken plane. I had exposed a dark, hidden pipeline that the airline was using for things that had absolutely nothing to do with passengers. The manager's face drained of all color, and he slumped against the wall as if the life had been drained out of him. The federal agent stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "You've opened a door you can never close, Captain. We aren't just talking about a grounded flight anymore. You've just stumbled into the middle of a massive, state-level investigation, and you are now the only person in this building who knows where the bodies are buried. And the people you just exposed, they aren't going to let you leave this airport alive. The room suddenly felt like the coldest place on earth as the agent clicked his cuffs onto my wrists, not to arrest me, but to protect me from the people already moving toward the room. As they pulled me out, I saw shadows moving in the hallway, figures that didn't belong to the police or the staff. The hunt had begun, and I was the prize. The federal agent, a man whose badge read Special Investigator Vance, shoved me into the back of a nondescript SUV parked in a restricted access loading zone. The terminal lights blurred as we sped toward the private airfield exit, but the sense of security I felt when we first left the interrogation room was rapidly evaporating. Vance wasn't heading to a police precinct. He was driving in the opposite direction, toward a cluster of unmarked hangars that bordered the perimeter fence. "Where are we going?" I demanded, my hands still restricted by the cuffs. "I'm supposed to be taken to a formal intake facility. If I'm a witness, I need legal counsel. You're taking me off-site." Vance didn't even glance back. He kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. "You don't understand the gravity of the illicit shipments I mentioned, Captain. The network using this airline isn't just cutting corners on maintenance. They're using the cargo holds for illegal transit. The man you challenged at the gate? He isn't just a wealthy passenger. He's the courier for a massive, multi-state group that uses this airline as a logistical backbone. When you grounded that plane, you didn't just cause a delay. You exposed their entire pipeline to federal scrutiny. They know who you are, and they have eyes everywhere." My mind raced. The white passenger hadn't just been an entitled elitist. He was an operative. The intimidation, the call to the manager. It was all a power play to ensure he could control the narrative and keep me from looking too closely at the cargo. Suddenly, a black sedan drifted out from behind a line of maintenance trucks, blocking our path. Vance slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. Before I could even process the movement, a window in the car ahead shattered. It wasn't gunfire. It was a sophisticated electronic pulse device. Every light on our SUV's dashboard went dead, and the engine cut out instantly. "Get out, now!" Vance shouted, kicking his door open and drawing his service weapon. We scrambled into the dark, rain-slicked space between two massive cargo hangars. The silence that followed was terrifying. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the muffled hum of the very flight I had grounded, now beginning to taxi toward the runway, likely under the command of a pilot who knew exactly what the cargo was. They were going to fly it regardless of the warnings, and now they were coming for me. "They're going to silence this entire incident," Vance hissed, pressing his back against the corrugated metal wall. "They have assets in the air, on the ground, and in the administration. I thought I had a secure route out, but they've tracked us. You have the drive, don't you?" I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing the small, cold metal of the flash drive. "Yes." "Then you're the only target that matters," Vance replied. He pulled a radio from his vest, but only static came back. "They've jammed our communication. We are on our own." A shadow detached itself from the side of the hangar. It was a man in standard airport maintenance coveralls, but the way he held his stance, legs wide, body balanced, was unmistakable. This wasn't a ground crew member. It was one of the radicals who had been sent to finish the job. He didn't speak. He just raised a hand, and I saw the glint of a dark object. Not a standard weapon, but something compact and silenced. Vance fired twice, the sound cracking like a whip against the metal. The operative dove behind a stack of shipping pallets. I used the distraction to scramble behind a row of empty fuel drums. "They're trying to prevent you from getting that data to the real authorities," Vance shouted over the rising wind. "You have to reach the secondary transmission tower at the end of this row. It's the only place with a hardline connection to the federal data backbone. Can you make it?" "Are you insane?" I yelled back. "You're asking me to run into a kill zone." "I'm asking you to survive," Vance countered, laying down suppressive fire. "If you don't transmit that file, the plane carrying the illicit materials will vanish over the ocean, and your life won't be worth a damn thing. Go! I waited for the next burst of gunfire, and then I bolted. My heart was a frantic drum, every muscle in my body screaming to stop. But the memory of the passengers on that flight, the elderly man in 1A, the families in the back, pushed me forward. I reached the base of the transmission tower just as a high-frequency whine began to fill the air. I scrambled up the steel ladder, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The rain was slicking the metal, making every step a gamble. I reached the small maintenance platform at the top, 20 feet above the tarmac, and fumbled for the interface panel. I plugged the drive in. The progress bar began to crawl across the screen, an agonizingly slow percentage count. 40%. 50%. A spotlight suddenly hit the tower, blinding me. From below, a voice boomed, amplified by a loudspeaker. "Captain, step away from the terminal. You're holding property of a private organization, and we're authorized to retrieve it by any means necessary." I looked down. Below me, the station manager stood next to a man in an expensive charcoal suit, the passenger from 1A. He wasn't just a traveler. He was the head of the operation. He looked up at me, his face twisted into a mask of pure hate. "You think you're the hero?" he yelled, his voice carrying easily in the dead of the night. "You're just a pilot who lost his mind. And when you fall from that tower, it won't be a tragedy. It'll be a suicide note." As he spoke, he stepped aside, and a group of men in tactical gear emerged from the shadows, raising their weapons. I hit the transmit button just as the first shot rang out, shattering the glass console next to my head. The progress bar hit 90%. I was trapped, with nowhere left to run, and they were closing in for the final, brutal act of their scheme. The progress bar hit 99%. My fingers were bleeding where I'd gripped the jagged steel, and the air around me was whistling with the lethal precision of incoming fire. The man from 1A, my tormentor, stepped into the light of the tower's base, his face a mask of predatory calm. He wasn't rushing. He knew I was cornered. To him, this was the final act of a long-planned containment. 100%, the screen blinked. I didn't wait for a confirmation. I ripped the drive out, tucked it into my flight suit, and dove off the platform. I didn't land gracefully. I plummeted, hitting the slick metal roof of a utility shed below, rolling off and crashing onto the rain-soaked tarmac. The impact jarred my teeth and sent a shockwave of pain through my ribs, but the transmission had gone through. I felt the familiar buzz of my phone, which I'd managed to secure in a waterproof pocket. A series of high-priority encrypted notifications pinged in succession. The data was live on the federal servers. "Get him!" the man from 1A screamed, his cool composure shattering into a frantic, high-pitched rage. I scrambled up, ignoring the agony in my side, and sprinted toward the perimeter fence. I could hear the roar of heavy engines approaching, not the airline's ground transport, but the deep, thundering vibration of military-grade aircraft. The sky above suddenly lit up with flares. Federal intervention had arrived, exactly as the data stream had triggered the emergency protocols I'd anticipated. The tactical team behind me stopped in their tracks. The men in black suddenly looked like small, desperate figures as armored vehicles smashed through the airfield gates, their sirens cutting through the dark like a blade. Lights blinded the operatives, and voice commands boomed across the tarmac, ordering everyone to surrender. I collapsed near the fence, my lungs burning, just as Vance emerged from behind a row of tankers, his weapon drawn. He stood over me, not as a captor, but as an ally. He took the drive from my hand, his eyes scanning the chaos unfolding on the runway. "You did it," he whispered. "The cargo hold on that flight? They're forced to land at the nearest military base. Every single person connected to this scheme is being rounded up as we speak." I watched as the man from 1A tried to flee toward a private hangar, only to be tackled by a pair of federal officers. The station manager, the man who had tried to erase my career and my dignity, was already on his knees, his hands clasped behind his head. The sight didn't just feel like justice. It felt like the weight of 15 years of silent, professional endurance finally being lifted. In the weeks that followed, the story broke nationwide. The elite passenger was exposed as a key figure in a massive logistics ring using commercial routes to move illicit, highly dangerous materials under the guise of prestige travel. The airline was forced into a total federal reorganization, and the internal security check I had triggered led to the dismantling of a corrupt leadership structure that had been rotting the company from the inside out for years. My name was cleared, though the media circus was something I had to learn to navigate. I didn't want the spotlight. I wanted the sky. After months of hearings and thorough investigations, my license was not only restored, but reinstated with a commendation for my commitment to safety protocols, a direct slap in the face to those who had tried to ground me for being an inconvenience. Returning to the cockpit for my first flight back felt like the first time I'd ever stepped into a plane. I performed the walk-around check with a level of scrutiny that made my new co-pilot smile. As I sat in the captain's seat, I looked out at the horizon. The world was still full of people who would judge me by my appearance before they ever listened to my voice. But I had learned a fundamental truth. My authority didn't come from a badge, a contract, or the approval of a platinum passenger. It came from my dedication to the craft and my refusal to blink when the pressure was at its peak. As the plane lined up for takeoff, I heard the familiar crackle of the radio. "Cleared for departure," the tower said. I pushed the throttles forward. The engines roared to life, a powerful, steady hum that drowned out every memory of the doubt, the fear, and the struggle. I eased the stick back, and as the wheels left the runway, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. I wasn't just a pilot anymore. I was a survivor, and the sky was finally, undeniably mine. I looked at the co-pilot, tipped my hat, and smiled. "Let's get them home safely," I said, and we climbed into the blue.